Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out on another wonderful and very hot Friday. My name is Kevin Dunn. I work for this school, the Institute of World Politics, helping set up events. I'm going to do I'm going to leave the formal introductions to Mr. Ahluwalia of the Livingston Group. However, by brief way of introduction, I wanted to introduce our school, a school which issues, I think, 16 certificates and 5 master degrees in statecraft and foreign affairs. And with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to the panel in what will certainly be an interesting discussion today. So, Mr. Ahluwalia.
Should I come there?
You're welcome. You can just tap the button on your panel mic and it should come through.
Well, Kevin, thank you. I want to thank IWP, especially Katie, who were able to put this event at a very short notice. And Air Marshal, thank you for taking our time from your hectic schedule. And so my friend Alex, who is a senior advisor for Congressman Randy Forbes, was able to take our time. It's basically IWP, which got the trend going, which was discussing about South Asia, growing Indian military and the U.S.-India relationships. And that's when a very compelling region, great strategic partnership between U.S.-India as it develops. So what we wanted to do was to just dive into it and see how we can take the dialogue forward and start conversing with folks. And Air Marshal, who has a long experience and a very competent man who's worked not only for the Indian Air Force, but is now working with Reliance as a President of Defence Aerospace, looking at the opportunity to see how we can bridge that relationship between both United States and India, help our U.S. defense companies to strategically partner with Indian defense company. And then my friend Alex, who has a large, robust picture of the entire developing U.S. Dominant role in Asia. So with Air Marshal giving more of a targeted focus for South Asia, and then our friend Alex taking off a larger picture for U.S. role in Asia. With that, Air Marshal, thank you again for being here. Look forward to having an interesting, open dialogue with the folks here. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Puneet and Alex. Is it okay? Yeah. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here this morning. And the subject of Indo-U.S. strategic partnership has been fairly animated over the last decade and a half, and it's gained more traction, particularly with the new government that took power in 2014, and you all are fairly aware as to how Prime Minister Modi is pushing this relationship to higher levels. Our interest on the subject is defense industry, and the issue of armament relationships between the two countries, defense industrial relationship between the two countries, and with India particularly, the issue of defense industry is closely linked to the issue of technology as well, and therefore there has been a lot of issues related to that. I must also say over the last decade, the U.S. suddenly has turned out to be one of the largest arms suppliers to India. We've had businesses close to about $14 billion over the last decade. You had sales of C-130, you had sales of C-17, the P-8I, and of course now the Army howitzer, lightweight howitzer, is moving ahead on that issue. Besides that, earlier we had the presidential aircraft for the Indian Air Force, and you had some of the technology-related EW equipment and self-protection suites related through. Most of it has come through the FMS route. But let me first address the issue and the opportunities that are huge over the, I would say, next decade and a half. A bit of background, before retirement, I headed the department that deals with long-term perspective plans, Defense Acquisition Council, and of course the force structure planning for the 3 services. So the Deputy Chief heading policy, plans, and force structures. So I'm pretty aware of what the policy changes are coming through. Much of it, let's take a look at the environment and what drives and what are the impediments that afflict some of those acquisition and procurement related issues in the Indian context. The threat environment, you all are aware, we live in one of the most volatile regions in terms of international relations and conflictual relations. We have Pakistan in the west and we have China in the north. With both, we have boundary-related, issues that has carried on for more than half a century, and it's not in sight of any serious resolution in the short term by any stretch of imagination. You all are also aware about the modernization processes for the Indian military continues to get afflicted by serious flaws that exist in the Indian decision-making process in the Ministry of Defence and the acquisition processes and policies related to that. For much of the last half a century and more, we have built the requirements or met the requirements of the Indian military through largely from a Russian source and the former Soviet Union source. And the reasons for all that is, we can discuss that during the question answers. But much of it relates to the Cold War environment and the perceived, perception on the US side that India is largely with the Soviet Union, and therefore, you were up against much of the technology denial regimes in most areas. The Indian strategy has also been to build manufacturing capability within the country, but it also made some serious blunders and flaws with respect to defense industry related issues. Right in the 50s and 60s, the Indian government made a policy decision that it will not get into export of arms. So that was a death blow to innovation and private sector involvement in the entire process. Second is, it also took a decision that private sector will not be allowed to come into defense industry, and therefore the heavy focus was on public sector, approach to build defense industrial production. And all that has actually evolved in a format in which defense industrial manufacture in India is largely licensed production. There is hardly any value addition in terms of serious innovation and serious design and development within the country. And even if that has happened, that has been driven largely by the Defense Research and Development Organization for much of it. The LCA story is quite well known. And the dependency on outside sources for critical technologies is quite acute. Okay, so this is what has actually sort of, we've reached a critical point, and with the new government, and this is the question mark that has actually been posed to the Prime Minister. If the Indian military is dependent to the extent of more than 70% on outside weaponry and import of weaponry, then there is a serious strategic vulnerability with respect to logistics support and technology vulnerability that exists in the country. And the second part of it is, much of these equipment, if it is imported directly, then it is also a loss to the country in terms of manufacture, creating jobs, creating opportunities for people to get to know the whole mechanism and then get involved in this innovation and development process. So it is not that only this awareness has hit the government only when Modi came to power. This actually started off post-Kargil environment. So post-Kargil, we did start the process of getting private sector into defense industrial manufacture, and that's been a very slow process. Then we had the Kelkar committee, which went through detailed interactions with private sector and detailed studies and made some very good recommendations. I've been part of that team for nearly half a decade. And much of those recommendations have not been acted upon by the previous government, and therefore it's remained status quo. The third issue that actually afflicted progress of defense industrial issue is that the foreign direct investment was limited to 26%, which virtually then doesn't allow anything to move meaningfully in that segment for investments to come in. And of course, the bias that existed in the Department of Defense production towards orienting all decisions towards defense production towards public sector. In fact, the defense finance and the bureaucracy tended to view public sector as their responsibility and private sector as somebody that needs to be looked at with suspicion. Much of all this has changed. So what has changed now? Let me also go back to the status of the military in the background of all this. The military's operational capability and dealing with equipment with the issue of technological obsolescence has been a battle, huge battle. And with a non-cooperative bureaucratic mechanism, with a non-cooperative Ministry of Defense, this process has been delayed enormously. So let me take the Indian Air Force itself. I was involved in the decision to select and go in for an advanced jet trainer. That selection was completed by the Indian Air Force in 1985. But final contract was signed in 2005 for the Hawk. In my opinion, by then the Hawk had already entered the territory of obsolescence. So we have actually signed a contract. We brought in an aircraft which is already 30 to 35 years old design. And although it's a good trainer aircraft, it may still meet the QRs that were laid out in 1985. In my opinion, it's a retrogressive step. And therefore the industrial partnership, although it is with HAL, doesn't really benefit the country as a whole. So this long decision-making chain is one of the major problem areas. The Howitzer agreement that the British Aerospace, U.S., the company of British Aerospace won the contract, that decision took 26 long years to arrive at. In fact, I was handling the Defense Acquisition Council in 2012 when this decision was made. Even after making the decision, you've taken another 4 years to sign the contract. It almost pretty much, got cancelled in between. So these are the major issues that are reflecting. And the Prime Minister has understood that part and is given a push towards addressing these issues. So what we did in 2014 was to first push the government, which is the previous government, towards increasing and enhancing the FDI, which against a lot of resistance went up to 49%. But in one of my reports that I gave, I said very clearly that high technology and high production standards, if you wanted to come in, then you must give the confidence to the OEMs that they have control over their technologies and they have control over the management, which is the case which needs to be understood. So while the government in 2014 said in the initial stages we will let the option of allowing 74% and 100% FDI in select cases, but that will be selected on case-by-case basis. The encouragement to that process was quite minimal. I think last month this government has recognized that and it said we will go in for the 49% is no more a restriction, and where companies want higher FDI control and they want control of the management, we are willing to go ahead and abide by that. So 100%, 74% or 51% or 60% is a thing that's open now as per policy. The status of the military is acute. Given the kind of threat perception that we face in the environment, while nuclear deterrence is in place, the space for conventional warfare and the space for conflict in the conventional domain exists in a big way. And therefore, your conventional deterrence depends on how well your force structures are meeting the requirements. The Indian Air Force, against the authorized squadron strength of 45 squadrons, is down to 32 squadrons. That's pretty much at parity with the Pakistani side. Much of its equipment needs replacement because of the obsolescence factor. The MMRCA story is quite well known. And so in all this, the government is now trying to push every procurement through the Make in India strategy. And therefore, the defense procurement policies revision in recent years, industrial licenses for private manufacture and joint ventures have been simplified enormously. It's virtually a single window clearances. But the priority in the procurement policy depends on the categorization priorities that the Indian government has articulated. The categorization, top categorization is towards priority will be towards Indian design developed product, And the next one is buy and make India. So which means, in the first case, let me be quite blunt and realistic. While the preference is towards encouraging Indian design, the much of that capability is quite peripheral, and it will take a long time. And therefore, to enhance capability in that domain, the government, that is only possible through joining up with OEMs and creating appropriate joint ventures and working on joint products that are required for the Indian military and, of course, the regional and the global scale. So that's the way. So, although on the face of it, IDDP says it is for Indian companies, it actually is a huge opportunity for the arms manufacturers the world over to actually come and set a business. And that is where 49% is no more a limitation. This is an attractive issue. The second part, which will be, when I handled it, most of our categorization now started getting pushed into that, is to bring in level playing field between public sector and private sector, and that is through buy and make. And buy and make is about, the production technologies to come in, and then, of course, going into joint ventures and working through joint development processes. The most important flaw that existed in the past development is much of Indian, leadership and the public sector industries tended to focus on the final product. So, because that's, interesting looking, or I would say, that's what sort of immediately hits people's minds quite well. So an aircraft or a ship or a tank, you tend to look at that. But the ladder of production, if you go through that process, then the most critical areas is to address the components and aggregates areas and the MRO areas. And this has been a weak area in the Indian industrial environment. So if the government wants the ecosystem to develop, that's an area they will have to address. So when OEMs now come in, let's say, the government are now looking at induction of a fighter aircraft for the Indian Air Force, because the Indian Air Force fighter strength is precariously low and will continue to keep going down unless they address it with a very emergency, provision. If the manufacture of fighter aircraft takes place, much of that technological IPR, etc., will get addressed. But the MRO components and aggregates is a huge business opportunity for both sides to actually set it up within the country, which will address both the cost, efficiency, lower costs, and better control in terms of maintenance and product support and life cycle support within the country. And actually speaking, these are all the most expensive areas that has not been addressed over the last 50 years. So when we did the MMRCA evaluation, and I was involved, the entire RFP was made under my direction, the MMRCA. When we did a comparative study, we found that while the acquisition cost of a Russian platform would be low, the life cycle cost of a Russian platform was prohibitively expensive. And this is the argument that the Indian Air Force put across to the government to say that we need to move into, firstly, bring in the factor of addressing life cycle costs and don't just go by L1 system. And MMRCA RFP was the first one to incorporate that process. And this is getting greater acceptance within the government. And the second part is you need to look at holistic, concept of cost of ownership, which includes life cycle costs, which includes MRO, which includes product, maintenance within the country. And this is what will address, the effectiveness of the military machine and the military operational capability. So where are the opportunities? So in my interactions with some of the American industries, the interactions with Indian industries and DRDO, who tend to play a role in any of the discussions for weapons acquisition, is that there is a problem with respect to technology. Okay, so let me now elaborate on the technology aspect of it. Much of the Indian bureaucracy is generalist bureaucracy. There are very few specialists who really understand the nuances of military technology aspects. The military service headquarters tend to remain a hands-off approach with respect to industry and with respect to DRDO. And that's where the mismatch comes about. So the tendency is to ask for technologies without understanding the ladder approach that must be taken to achieve high-end technology absorption as well as development. So a classic example is the Kaveri engine development in India. So it's taken 30 years plus to actually reach a certain stage. But if you go back and analyze, and this is what I brought out in my study, is that here's not a single aero engine of a simple aero engine design has ever been designed and made in India before that. And when the LCA program started, you straight away said we will make a fourth generation aero engine, along which will coincide with the LCA's development. That was a blunder in the first place. Second is the fourth generation engine is firstly, aero engine development is a complex. It is the toughest domain in the aerospace sector. If a country can actually address the design, development, and complete development cycle completion, and then go into production of aero engines successfully, it has arrived as a leader in the aerospace domain, because it addresses materials, it addresses design issues, it addresses optimization of the thermodynamic cycle, which is the toughest thing. In all that, without a research database accessible to you, if you can hack it, then you would have actually crossed and leapfrogged a certain stages phenomenally. Okay, they should have understood, the government should have understood that, but that was a flaw. So we pretty much actually went about trying to it. That they've got some kind of a working model on the ground for this fourth generation engine is very creditable. But it has serious problems. In my analysis, in my report I pointed out, they will take another 20 years. They may still hack it, but it will take 2 decades plus. And therefore, you needed actually partnerships and OEMs to handhold you. Nobody will give you access to a complete database. But if you actually collaborate well and bring in business attractions to both sides, and there is a mutual benefit on both sides in terms of business and long-term partnerships, then they will handhold you to learn through their databases to some extent. And that's all that is required. So it doesn't matter if you take another 15 years to address this. Now that you started off on this, you should have started off on a first generation engine first and then move on to the derivative subsequently. Now that you've gone halfway through, you need a handholding from somebody to finish this process. And then you can now jump off and then move into higher domain engines quite well. India has selectively done very well in certain areas. Space is a very good example. Atomic energy is another example. But they've all done because they were isolated from bureaucratic interference. They were managed by technocrat leadership. They understood their limitations quite well. Indian Space Agency has fantastic collaborative arrangements with other space agencies of the world. And therefore, the mutual benefit and mutual interdependence is quite well recognized. And because they don't delve into the military security related space domain overtly, the partnerships work quite well. Okay, on the other hand, the DRDO and others have actually, and I agree with that statement, tend to claim much more than what really exists on the ground. And that creates a problem in the partnership. So here now, this is something that the government now wants the Indian industry to understand. Get into partnership, they are driving them. Get into partnerships, bring in manufacturing into the country. Give most of the products that should be supplied to the Indian military. And the requirement is huge. Let me put it this way. We would require in the next 15 years something like $150 billion worth of equipment to be inducted. Okay, I mean not even 15 years, in less than 10 years. And if that much of it is going to be imported, it makes no sense. So get that manufacturing within the country. Leave the learning process to a business partnership between the industries. You will work that out between yourselves. And therefore, let policies not be hampering that process. So the government direction to the bureaucrats is that make policies that can enable manufacture within the country, that can enable partnerships to develop for triggering innovation and development. And this is what is, I think, the general focus. Where do these military stand on this issue? I think they've understood their weaknesses, the Air Force in particular, the Navy in particular. The Army is now coming along. And they would want best of the systems to come in. But for example, now the government has said, we will go in and sign the contract for 36 Rafales with the French, which has been selected, which is a government-to-government deal. But that's too small to fill in the Air Force's immediate requirements. the requirement is further 126 or further 200 aircraft. In the next 5 years, the Indian Air Force will have to induct close to 500 to 600 aircraft. And the government says, let that now go through the Make in India process. And now you had Lockheed Martin and Boeing coming and giving huge proposals, massive presentations have been given. But I always keep saying the State Department is so still living in the past Cold War syndrome that your regulations and your policies prohibiting technology transfer with respect to critical technologies and even archaic, mundane technologies is so restrictive that the Indian government and the Indian Air Force chief last week told us none of that proposal is attractive at all. On the other hand, you look at the others who are offering like Saab, they've opened out their books completely and partnerships. So the government not saying transfer this to me, work with somebody, create partnerships, go into the private sector, but get the manufacturing done within the country. I think there are huge opportunities. We need to understand each other quite well and then exploit this entire process. I think I'll stop here and I'll open out, after Alex finishes, the time for a lot more, question-answer interactions. I think that would be, more beneficial for all of us.
If I may say, before Alex comes in, I think, Air Marshal, you've really been brought us from the past to the present where India stands in regards to the opportunities and the hindrances they had before in terms of the long decision-making process, along with looking to build the fourth generation when you're not even built the first generation, and then also the bureaucratic interference, and then the opportunities that are available to U.S. companies and other OEMs to have 100% ownership and plus the FDI. And plus, at the same time, bring the joint venture relationships, which will help to enable innovation. So I think we are poised in a very unique era where India needs about $150 billion worth of defense equipment in the coming years. And I guess looking at that, we have to look at our own U.S. State Department to see the issues, the impediments that exist so that we can get past that, so we are able to build this relationship on a strong footing. Now with that, I give you Alex Gray, who works with Congressman Forbes, who is the chairman of Sea Power Readiness, and you played a very major role in helping and defining our sea power readiness. So with that, Alex, enlighten us all, please. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me here. Thanks to Puneet, and following the Air Marshals a tough act, but I will do my best. Talk about two things, really. One, kind of trying to get beyond, in my capacity working for Congressman Forbes the last 4 years, he chairs the Congressional China Caucus, and he also has been chairman of the Sea Power Projection Forces Subcommittee in the House, which has jurisdiction over basically the entire U.S. Navy and the Air Force's projection platforms. So it fits nicely into this discussion. I want to talk really about kind of getting beyond the discussion of the U.S. rebalance to Asia. It's a glib term. It really is. It's something that we all know the U.S. has been in Asia since 1945 and perhaps even before, if you want to argue that. So to say that we're rebalancing or pivoting, it's a little glib. So I want to talk more generally about the future power dynamic in Asia, which is the U.S. and China in a long-term peacetime competition and the role India plays in that dynamic. And I think that fits in with what the Air Marshal is talking about at the defense cooperation level. And then secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we need to do. The Air Marshal kind of teed this up. We have a lot of restrictive export rules, a lot of restrictive technology transfer rules in the United States that are outdated, outmoded, kind of a product of the 1960s, 1970s. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the tangible things that Congress and the executive branch can do to solve some of the things the Air Marshal was talking about. I think to start with, we need to kind of reframe our mental map of the Asia Pacific. And when policymakers in Washington talk about the Asia Pacific, historically they have a very narrow perception of what that is. It's basically an arc that runs from Siberia down what the Chinese call the first island chain, runs the Korean Peninsula, Japan, China, maybe Southeast Asia, maybe not, depending on who you're talking to, and that's about it. And I think we need to really broaden our view of what Asia means in a U.S. security policy context. And I say that mainly because that's what the Chinese say. And if you view the U.S. as being in a long-term, an analyst has called it the 100-year marathon, if you view a long-term competition between the United States and China, we should listen to what they say. And their writings, their experts, when they talk about this marathon, they're not talking about just what I described. They're talking about a competition that goes from what they call the third island chain, which is the Hawaiian Islands, all the way to some folks have talked about the Mediterranean. China Military Science, which is one of their premier military journals, has talked about, and over the course of the next 50, 75 years, China will need to have a presence in the Atlantic Ocean. So that may be a stronger, more expansionist view than we need to take credibly. But these are the terms of reference that they're using. And we need to, when we're thinking about this, we need to at least have our map extended a little farther than normal. So I like the term Indo-Pacific. I think Indo-Pacific is descriptive for American purposes, and it's descriptive in terms of how the Chinese view the region. I think, if we're thinking about the maritime geography and we're thinking about a competition that stretches over the whole of the Indian Ocean basin, the role India is going to play in that is obvious, and it's tremendously important from an American perspective. India is the maritime key to the Indian Ocean basin, obviously, and Chinese understand that. And if you look at Chinese procurement, you look at Chinese doctrine, you look at how they set the terms of reference, their behavior in the region, they see India as the kind of one of the key geographic features and impediments to their expansion in different ways throughout that basin. So I think most of you are probably familiar with where we are in terms of China and India relations. What I find most people are focused on the land disputes. It's important, and I wouldn't minimize it, but what we really need to be thinking about is the maritime domain. And the maritime domain is everything from the Bay of Bengal, Sri Lanka, through the whole scope of the Indian Ocean, heading up towards the Persian Gulf. And the Chinese have a very geopolitic sense of this. They see the future of the Indian Ocean basin being intricately linked to their need for resources that come from the Middle East. And if you look at the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, their doctrine over the last 10 years has continued to call for an expeditionary capability that's going to allow them to project power. And Americans tend to think of that as South China Sea, East China Sea. It's much more than that. And their words, take them at their word. They see, we've heard for years this string of pearls discussion where they're going to have bases in Pakistan or port agreements in places like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and they're going to have a presence throughout the Indian Ocean basin. They're building a military capability to allow them to make that a reality. And you see it in amphibious ships, you see it in long-range submarines, you see it in the way that their training doctrine is slowly growing and adjusting for learning to resupply at sea. They've been using their opportunity in participating in the anti-piracy missions in the Horn of Africa to learn at-sea replenishment, which is a tremendously useful skill if you want to be able to project power over long distances. So I think that dynamic, US, China, India, in the maritime domain, is one that Washington really needs to be aware of and cognizant of, and it needs to reflect our interests and India's interests need to be seen in a much more compatible light. So let's talk a little bit about how the US can respond to that dynamic. The Air Marshal spoke very eloquently about what we need to be doing from a defense cooperation standpoint. And he talked about India's institutions and India's history as it relates to private sector and government involvement in defense. U.S. institutions, I've had a front row seat to this on the Armed Services Committee. U.S. institutions for foreign military sales, for commercial technology transfers are outdated too. And they're a relic of a period of the Cold War. And they don't, like a lot of these things, they haven't been updated. And the U.S.-India relationship is kind of a unique animal. It's, India has its history of non-alignment, and the U.S. has kind of a history with India that's fraught. It goes back for a long time, that especially since the nuclear test in the 1990s, the U.S. made some decisions after that I think we're still trying to backtrack from and get the relationship back on a responsible tack. And as we do that, we look at things like the U.S. military critical technologies list, which is what the Pentagon compile. It's an interagency process, but there's a compilation of technologies that the U.S. considers sensitive for a variety of reasons. And the list is extremely long, and the process by which a technology ends up on that list or is removed from that list is Byzantine. And it requires a tremendous amount of lobbying, both by, if you are an American defense firm and your technology is on that list, and you think that is a relic of era that's past, and you think that there is opportunity to do business with a country like India, the process of getting that technology removed borders on the impossible, at least very, very difficult. And it hamstrings us in terms of trying to do important business with India. So I think there are a lot of things the U.S. can do to improve defense cooperation. I would name that as number one, that we need Congress has a role to play, the executive branch obviously has a role to play, but we really need to start reevaluating our export control mechanisms, our export licensing mechanisms, the military critical technologies list, and coming up with a process that reflects kind of a couple of imperatives. I mean, imperative one, obviously we need to be protecting our critical technology, no one would argue that, but we need to do it in a way that's not creating additional barriers for other strategic goals. And I think U.S.-India defense cooperation, enhancing that, is a strategic goal, and it's something that we need to be elevating in our dialogue, and we can't let these bureaucratic mechanisms like the critical technologies list be such a roadblock to something that is as critical as enhancing this relationship. So one of the things, I've got a couple of just brief thoughts on specific ways we can go about a very tangible way enhancing this cooperation and fixing some of the institutional impediments on the American side. One, we need, and this has been floated in Congress for a while, I don't think it's ever been in the right legislative mechanism, but we need to really be thinking about mandating an assessment that whether it's the probably the Department of Defense, but it could even be an interagency process, that annually a report should be given to Congress of India's, I think the best term is strategic operational capabilities. What are India's strategic operational capabilities, and where are the gaps, where are the opportunities? And to be effective, this would be an assessment that would be directed by Congress to the U.S. government. It would have a classified and an unclassified annex. Now, I found in my experience, having a classified annex is important if we're trying to actually, do these things are done at the classified level. There needs to be that component, but there also needs to be an unclassified component. There needs to be a component that's open to the public, that people like us can sit around, we can have a conversation in public about this, and we can try and move the needle of this discussion openly. So I think if we can find a way, and there's been discussion about putting it in the annual defense bill, there's been discussion about putting it in other areas, if we can find a way to mandate an assessment like this, where we're thinking of India as a strategic partner, and we're asking ourselves, where is India now? Where do they need to go? And keeping in mind the U.S.-China strategic competition, how does India fit into this puzzle, and how do its military capabilities fit in this puzzle? And if we have that document at a high level, I think it will really help galvanize discussion of where we need to be going from the defense cooperation side. I think we also have had a history going back many decades of thinking about our cooperation with India as interoperability. we want to create interoperable cooperation, things that we can do with India in counterterrorism, in humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. That's not wrong. I mean, that's a very valuable way to think about the relationship. But I think as the competition in the Indo-Pacific unfolds, we want to also be thinking about how do we help India get operational advantages? Let's just be honest about it. Let's stop kind of hiding behind some of the buzzwords about interoperability. We want India to become an increasingly credible military power in the Indo-Pacific. That's an American strategic imperative. How do we further that? How do we make that a reality? And if we kind of reorient our thinking away from just, well, we'd like when we do counterterrorism exercises and the Malabar exercise that we do every year, we want to be able to interoperate with the Indians. If we move away from that a little bit and we start thinking, how do we make India a more operationally credible military partner to uphold its interests in the region, knowing that those interests really are becoming increasingly compatible with our interests. So I think kind of changing how we think about cooperation from the American side is really important. Finally, the joint strategic vision for the Indian Ocean, which was put out after the last President Obama visit to India, it needs, it's a good document, it's short, it's kind of a catalyzing statement that has a couple of bullet points about the US-India relationship. It's very good. What it needs to talk about more is the direct impact of US-India cooperation on US interests in the region. And we need to speak more clearly about India's military strength and India's military modernization is something that is a direct American interest. And I know a lot of people, we talk about these things and people roll their eyes and they say, well, these are just bureaucratic talking points. I promise you, the Chinese read these things. They view, we will put out resolutions on Capitol Hill honoring the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, for example. And it will be front page news in the People's Daily in Beijing. They take these symbolic documents as a very real test of American commitment to the region and our commitment to different strategic partnerships. So making sure that these documents, like the Indian Ocean Joint Strategic Vision, making sure that those reflect the seriousness with which we attach the US-India defense partnership, I think that's a critical way to signal what we're about. Finally, I talked a little bit about the military critical technologies list. I think just a broader, and this is something Congress can lead this, a broader discussion of how to refine our export restrictions and our controls for the modern era in light of, less focus on the bureaucratic checking the boxes, making sure that everything is running smoothly, and more, how can these restrictions further our broader political interests, and not having these lists and restrictions and controls and license requirements, not having those as an obstacle, but finding a way to make those work for us rather than the other way around. I think that's critical. One specific example that I've dealt with that is an area where we can really do some good from a congressional standpoint and from the executive branch, aircraft carriers. There are specific technologies. I'm thinking specifically of the EMAL system, which is the electromagnetic launch system for carrier aircraft. There's a tremendous amount of interest in US industry and being able to work with Indian firms on this technology. There are bureaucratic licensing and export obstacles. I tend to think that this is an area where there's a win-win-win for everyone. And if we can find a way to get ourselves to a place where those kind of broader interests, encouraging an Indian indigenous naval aviation capability, that should supersede some of the bureaucratic hurdles that are 40 years old now. So I think that's a perfect example of a place where we can really make some progress if we can get our institutional problems under control. Finally, the Air Marshal talked about foreign military sales. I absolutely agree. Foreign military sales are important, but building this indigenous industry-to-industry cooperation. I think it's even more important. I will say for the FMS, the Harpoon Block 2 submarine-launched anti-ship missile, which, as of my last look at it, was still pending. It was something that we were working with the Indians on transferring, but it was still pending. If you think about a maritime environment like we're in, if you think about the maritime challenges that India faces and how that impacts on the United States and our interests, something like transferring Harpoons is absolutely essential. And I would love to see if we could speed that process, and if all the stakeholders on the American side could sit down and kind of say, there's a critical Indian operational need for that capability, and that directly impacts America's operational requirements and strategic imperatives in the region. Let's make this happen. So, just some thoughts. Thanks.
Well, Alex, that was wonderful what you said. In fact, talking about Indo-Pacific, and especially if you see the topography of India, it's the way it's laid out in the Indian Ocean is the only one which can really be a deterrent to the growing China's design. And I think it's in the best interest of our nation to look at India as a great strategic partner, and that is a unique relationship on building that. And I think the other thing you said, those impediments which are there in those State Department bureaucratic issues which needs to be removed, you need good lobbying. I know a great lobbying firm called the Livingston Group, which can help in those issues. But I think it's true. It's through a clear strategic vision for interest in the United States that lies in the Indian Ocean, because 90% of trade is going past that region. So it's important for us to look at it and see how we can come up a mandate from the Congress every year to look at what's classified and unclassified and strategically in our best interest. What I would like to do is, at this point, want to open it up to questions so that we can have a very more pointed, deeper dive conversation, thanks to A. Marshall and Alex, which we promised at IWP was to have more of a very transparent conversation, because a lot of people try to not, be more sensitive to issues, but a deliberate, open dialogue so that it's fruitful for the folks. So Kevin is here. So please.
Yes, my name's Joel Hetker. I do research National Archives. Is there any role for SAARC? Is that sort of a moribund group?
SARC, okay. In the context of regional mechanism and a regional grouping, that's a process, ongoing process from the Indian perspective particularly. India would like it to move forward a little faster in terms of greater integration and greater cooperation. But the impediments that come in the way. So you have Pakistan that plays a different game. They want other aspects of what India calls as bilateral problems to come into the grouping, which India completely objects to it. And that pulls down the grouping's cohesiveness to some extent. In my analysis, SARC will always have a problem unless you actually look at it from a different perspective. In any regional grouping, the economics should be the driver, and economic integration should be the main process through which you keep increasing cohesiveness of the regional groupings to become better and better. That's how the story of ASEAN has been. That's how the story of EU has been. In SARC, India is too huge for the other members. And second, the interdependency works more, from dependency on India for a variety of various issues for the smaller neighbors than, India's dependency on them. And therefore, that creates a certain amount of insecurity in their minds at the political level. And therefore, anything that is offered is always viewed with some kind of a suspicion. For a good regional grouping to emerge and have some chance of actually bringing in better success in that process, I think you have to go beyond SAARC. If I put it bluntly, SAARC, it can only reach this much, and that's about it. So if they now open out better, and that's what we're talking about, the Indian Ocean Rim States is the better grouping. Unfortunately, politics have come in there because you have bigger players and bigger, more powerful economies coming into play, like Australia, you have South Africa, you have the ASEAN states coming in. If that grouping actually can come in together a little better, then that has huge potential. And that potential, there are about 48 states that will come into the from the East African coast to the entire Gulf and all those areas. There are some of them who will need immense support from countries like India, Australia, and South Africa to be able to financially help them overcome some of their problems. That cohesiveness can actually bring about a huge economic grouping, and the trade potential and the interactive potential is huge. But there are political impediments in that process. One of the fundamental issues, how religion plays its role in that entire region. So that's a way to look at it. But the India's approach has been to remove the divisive, issues that keep, playing problematic role in the SAARC. And I think it has succeeded under Modi over the last 2 years. So Bangladesh has come on board, Nepal is coming on board, Bhutan has always, has been, very supportive of India's position. And if you don't go on to the Indian Ocean, if you try and bring in Afghanistan and Myanmar into the grouping, which they are there partly, then I think we can, work towards enhancing that ability to some extent.
I think on building on that, you just redrew the map. If I see, Marshal, you said Australia, India, and South Africa. So basically, you're looking at us to look at that map and that line to be viewed as the Indo-Pacific.
That's right.
And that means that it just basically is not SAARC only. Now it's just larger countries finding a way to build on trade and on issues they can agree on. So
absolutely. I mean, taking off from where Alex said, Indian Ocean is a domain for India to actually naturally, play its role more effectively. And it's an area that India needs to dominate, but dominate in a benevolent way. And most countries are looking for that, particularly the Southeast Asian countries and much of the East African countries look for India to play a greater role. And in spite of Chinese, doling out huge financial assistance to quite a lot of these countries, China is always viewed with great amount of, trepidation and suspicion. And the increasing role, if China, the string of pearls that he spoke about, I wouldn't give too much credit to string of pearls, but then there is some truth in that entire process in terms of operationalizing their replenishment capabilities for their forces through other mechanisms, anti-piracy mechanisms, etc. And therefore, Hambantota, Gwadar, as they materialize, they become significant, have a significant potential to enhancing the Chinese Navy's capabilities in that region. And that's a huge problem for India. And that's a huge problem for the other countries as well. So there is a lot of potential for India to play and enhance a role in the Indian Ocean domain, and that's what they should do. For that, you need to focus on rebuilding your Navy much more rapidly. And there, the aircraft carrier, the Indian Navy needs, the plan is there, quite well articulated, that we are focusing on building a 3 aircraft carrier Navy, which means you will need actually to have about 5 aircraft carriers to have 3 operational carrier groups at any one point of time. Time for living with 16,000 ton, 20,000 ton, 30,000 ton aircraft carrier is gone, because I fully consider it may be okay for experience up to this point of time, but it's a waste of time and waste of effort and financial resources. You need to go beyond 65,000 ton carriers, and I think that sense has come into these things. So the second carrier, the first carrier is a 40,000 ton carrier, which is halfway through. The second carrier will be a 65,000 ton carrier, and it's a huge opportunity for naval cooperation. And Reliance has acquired it is the largest modern shipyard that Reliance has acquired in the Gujarat coast. It has one of the longest dry docks in Asia. And so these are all huge potentials for companies to get together and expand this entire opportunity quite well.
My name is Josh. My name is Josh. I'm with the Atlantic Council. This is for Alex. I'm curious what you think the focus has been on in the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee with regard to India. Whether you think that focus is misguided or useful, and which other members of the House you find to be particularly constructive players with regards to Indian policy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I'd start by saying, the Armed Services Committees and in both chambers and the Foreign Affairs Committees in both chambers are, they're creatures of politics. We want to, those of us who are in the policy weeds, we don't want to think of them that way, but they are. So, the staff resources on all the 4 of those committees are Middle East focused, and that's where the focus of the voters is, that's where the focus of the members are. So really, if you look at the emphasis that's put on anything that's not Middle East focused, the last, you could say 15 years, but I'm just going to say 5 years, it's minimal. It's unfortunate, but it's been small. My boss has worked tirelessly, I would say, to try and change that. Still a work in progress. The extent to which India is a focus, it's in the Pakistan context. I don't think that personally, I've never thought that was helpful. I've never thought that taking India and seeing it through the prism of this kind of one bilateral relationship, important bilateral relationship, obviously, but seeing it in such a narrow context is not helpful. And one of the things that we tried to do on the House Armed Services Committee through several different NDAAs, defense bills, was to talk about India as a strategic partner. And as the clear focus of that language, and you can go back and look at it, was India-U.S. cooperation in the context of China's rise. And we, as I said, language like that, people can dismiss it as it's just language that's inserted in a many 1,000-page bill. It is perceived in the region. It is read in the region. Those things show up in, India Express. They show up in the People's Daily. They show up in places where, regional leaders are paying attention. So the extent to which we can broaden that India conversation and have it about the region, the Indo-Pacific, U.S. broader strategy, that's what the committee should be doing. To specific members, I would say Rob Whitman, Congressman Whitman from Virginia, who's going to speak here in a couple months. He's someone who, Mr. Forbes leaves office in January. I think Mr. Whitman's going to take a much larger role in Asia-Pacific policy. He's probably going to be chairman of Mr. Forbes's Sea Power Subcommittee, so he's going to play a very important role. I would say Ed Royce, who's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Royce is also a really thoughtful guy on this subject. There's going to be a new chairman of the East Asia Subcommittee in the House, so not sure who that's going to be yet, but that's going to be someone people who care about this are going to be looking to for leadership and guidance. So, there's work to do, but I think we have made some progress the last couple of years.
Quickly, I just want folks to know, September 20th, what Alex shared is we're doing an event with Congressman Whitman right here at IWP. They've been very gracious enough to host us again. It's all again about rebalancing Asia, focus of U.S.-India relationships, because we realized how key and important it is to define that U.S.-India unique relationship. It should not be brought in because of the Pakistan factor or for the other factor. It should be a standalone factor in the best interest of our nation. So with that, I request the next question, please. He's been waiting for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, we have enough time.
Right, thank you. So my name is Tisura Gamage, and I'm a graduate student from Sri Lanka. It's a recent example that China's military modernization in the Asia-Pacific has been tremendously problematic to its neighbors. You have conflicts with Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, and the whole rest of it. So my question is, I understand that India's military modernization is very requirement in the modern age, and it's an integral part of the security of its neighboring states also. But how do you think India can guarantee the security cooperation between its states so that there will not be a Thucydides trap amongst its neighboring states, and there will be an assurance? Like, India has generally been benevolent towards its neighbors, but how do you guarantee that through institutional arrangements? Thank you.
Well, I think history is the best, teacher to affirm India's, the kind of policies and the kind of strategies that it follows with respect to India's neighbors. Every one of India's South Asian neighbors, India has constantly gone out of its way to actually send out a message that India is not a threat to you at any time, correct? In spite of a lot of suspicious views. I think that is just politics that keeps getting played out. India-Pakistan is a different issue. But you look at, if India was wanting to actually demolish and absorb any country, it could have done that with Bangladesh in 71 quite easily. Okay, I mean, you can't get a better example of that. It could have done that with Nepal any time. It could have done that with Bhutan. Sikkim is a different story because they wanted to merge with India, and therefore that was accepted. Okay, otherwise, it could have played that, so it is firstly not interested, one. Second, given the kind of population density that exists and given the kind of diversity that exists in the South Asian region, it doesn't want to add problems more on its hand. That is actually, that's the most important driving factor for it. And therefore, the idea is to actually, one, we need to understand the South Asian civilizational context. There is a lot of unifying thread that runs through every one of the countries of the region. And in that context, there is civilizational unity to a large extent. But there is also a lot of diversity, exceptional development in regional literatures and languages and subcultures. And therefore, that diversity needs to be respected. And therefore, the best way for neighbors to work together is to recognize that strength within themselves. And from a practical point of view, you have to accept the reality that the Indian state, geography, and the economy is too huge for anyone to get worried about the threat. If you view it as a threat, it will always remain a threat because it's too huge. Okay, and the second one is, on the other hand, if you want to actually increase economic interaction, as Sri Lanka has done with India now, and it's a huge benefit to the smaller countries. Bangladesh is doing it now. And therefore, it makes sense to actually increase your trade and economic interactions and cultural interactions with India, rather than keep it away and keep looking the other side. I think that would be a short-sighted approach.
Before I take, Marshal, could you also elaborate, because there are times where folks will say there's a threat of exploding India. From the U.S. perspective, how do we mitigate our own feeling of insecurities and the Cold War syndrome that exists? How do we overcome those issues, but despite the local issues in South Asia? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, let me actually put it in a very open and a blunt way. When we started interacting in the early 2000s, particularly on the MMRC and few other issues, I perceived that the general approach to State Department officials is that how they've interacted with the rest of the world over the entire, post-Cold War world, post-Second World War, period. So you expect India to officially and formally align itself with the U.S. to tell the world that it's a partner to the U.S. That's not going to happen. That will never happen. Because strategic autonomy is not only at the core of India's national objectives, it is also a political issue. So politicians in both countries and all over the world tend to work on issues which guarantees their survivability. So if you actually raise an issue that attacks their own makes their survivability a question, they're not going to agree to that. That's one issue. But the second thing is, for a great, a huge country and a huge population, 1.2 billion population like India's, the strategic autonomy is an extremely important parameter. And from the country's birth in 1947, if that has been underwritten as the fundamental issue in its foreign policy, and its interaction with the rest of the world, then that's not going to change. So that's a reality that we need to accept. But now coming over to that, gone are the days of Cold War, gone are the days that India viewed U.S. with suspicion all the time. And let me give you an example. We interacted very closely in the LCA program. The fly-by-wire interaction was fairly close on the LCA program. And for a country that hasn't, produced, it did a very good aircraft. HF-24 was designed and developed with Kurt Tank's assistance. But after that, it went to sleep for another 20 years. And then you got on to jumping, like the Kaveri engine example that I gave you. You wanted to make a 4.5 generation aircraft with a fly-by-wire, with not much of an experience in aircraft design and development, but they did a fantastic job of doing it finally. But in that a lot of help came from the American side. A lot of interaction took place. But when 98 happened, the test module that was there with the American side was confiscated, and here they were left high and dry. It delayed the LCA program by 5 years easily. But I remember Abdul Kalam, and I was a project manager for the program at that time, and therefore he making a statement in the group of all the designers, the developers, scientists, and the Air Force there, is that I'm glad this has happened because the umbilical cord is cut. You will learn to walk on your own. And sure enough, that happened. So, these created some of those, incidences which creates all the time a sense of suspicion. But I think over the last 15, 20 years, we've gone past that. So the time is right now. But don't expect India to formally become an ally. It will never do that. But allies it will be, because two are vibrant democracies. There are a lot of congruence in their approach to international issues. There is, at culturally and social level, the number of Indian students who come and study here are huge, and that will continue to be there, because you view the American education system as hugely beneficial for Indian students' development. There's a lot of trade that happens. There are a lot of cultural exchange that happen. My both children have done their graduate programs here in the U.S. So I think, you have this relationship is only going to go stronger. But you need to recognize that, and I think American leadership will recognize that. So when you recognize that strategic autonomy is at the heart, much like how France went about it in the 50s and 60s, and that conflict was there when US said, if you're not part of the NATO, you're not with us. So you need to recognize that officially it has to deal with its own position and its own image in the region and in the world with respect to China, Southeast Asia, and its neighbors, that it is not a subservient client state or an ally state of the US, but it's an independent state, and it's emerging as a pole position in the international system. That needs to be recognized. And if you recognize that, then at the substrata, there is virtually an alliance, because India recognizes that US is a technological leader in the world, and therefore we need to learn a lot from them. And there is a lot of business opportunities, so let's now tie up and work towards that. And much of the apprehensions with respect to IPR or with respect to other issues, because India deals with both sides of the technologies, and I think that can easily be addressed, because India has a very fine ability to firewall different segments and ensure the interests of the concerned parties are not actually damaged.
Can I just add briefly? The U.S. has had fraught relations with almost all the countries that are our major partners and allies. Relations that were Germany and Japan, the obvious examples. But even, you look at some of the ASEAN countries, look at the Philippines. We've had much more difficult relationships historically with a lot of the countries that we consider kind of our foundational building blocks in the region than we have with India. And we have a lot more natural convergence of interests with India. And my argument will always be that the maritime domain between the convergence of interest between the US and India and the maritime domain is such an overriding convergence that I just have a hard time imagining over the long term that history that's nowhere near as difficult as some of our other bilateral histories would deter us from growing closer. So.
The gentleman in the back.
Henry Hetker. I wondered, the Air Marshal indicated that
there's a problem with the Russian platform on some recent purchase, I guess, from Russia of aircraft, military aircraft. And I wondered, one of the Gulf nations bought a whole fleet of Russian aircraft. I can't remember which company, but not a single one was operational. They regretted the entire purchase. They didn't know what to do about it. But, well, when you see an American, military aircraft, an F-22, an F-35, they usually stay in the back of their product. In time, they test them enough, so they're more than adequate, although they're usually more costly than the Russian aircraft. But then you have quality. What to do? Is it better to buy quality and have a smaller arm, air arm, or is it better to have a massive air arm of possibly inadequate aircraft? That's a decision any country has to make. And of course, we've sold many aircraft all over the world for many years. What are your feelings on this? You have to make an agreement with the members of parliament, the legislative arm of India, all other types of officials. There's the need to involve India itself as far as its, beginnings of defensive industrial type companies, defense companies. All these are other factors. But when it comes to a real problem that any country can face, they've got to have something they can count on, not something that they might be able to count on. What do you think of all this? Do you think there's been a mistake in ordering a great deal of Russian aircraft, or you can put up with it?
Well, okay, it's a very important question. So I have flown the MiG-21s for the first half of my career, and I swear by that aircraft. It's a fabulous aircraft to fly. Okay, that's one. I've commanded a Jaguar squadron. Okay, so my second half of career was on the Western platforms. I'm an experimental test pilot. I've commanded my flight test centers. I've pretty much flown all the aircraft in the Indian Air Force. And I've interacted. I've flown at Edwards here. I've flown in Sweden and most of the other countries. And therefore, I understand the industry here, the whole process, everything here. You're absolutely right in the sense that if we sign a contract, let's say the Jaguar contract was signed, and the product support with British Aerospace, and then the aircraft was manufactured by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. And in every case, or our own, we bought the Mirages, in 1985, and the Mirages, performed extremely well. So the Western design is well optimized towards cost effectiveness and getting the maximum buck for the bang. Okay, so second is, in terms of contractual obligations, once the contract is signed, they abide by that without any hassles. Okay, so and therefore, we haven't had much problems with respect to Western fleets. With respect to Russian fleets, you must go back and understand the Russian design philosophy. Russian design philosophy was state-centric, and it encouraged its designers to bring out the best products to meet its combat objectives. It couldn't care less about what cost effectiveness was. In fact, they don't understand cost effectiveness. So when you talk about an engine on condition maintenance philosophy, it is Greek to the Russian designers. Okay, so when I deal with them, that's an issue. From that, now Russia's, Soviet Union has collapsed, and Russia has moved into, more westernized, half westernized, format. There's a market economy, and they're trying to grapple with a lot of that. All that has actually complicated matters for the Indian Air Force, because the supply chain is hugely impacted, because their own industries are in a bit of a doldrum. Plus, they're trying to catch up. Most of their weapons during the Cold War times were sold with political objectives, and therefore there is no relation to the cost of production or the overall cost issues. Now they're trying to make up, and therefore they hike up the price enormously, and they don't abide by the contract. They keep periodically revising the prices, and that hurts the Indian system enormously. So you have two problems. You don't have the supply chain being maintained effectively, and that is that's where the problem of India not having addressed those issues of creating an industry addressing components, aggregates, and MRO issue within the country, and therefore you are depending on supplies of components and aggregates. And that hurts you enormously, and reliability is a big question mark. So you're right. Now The aircraft carrier is a classic example. Contract that was signed for $700 million finally ended up, towards 2.8 billion. And that's the kind of revisions that took place. Of course, lots of value additions did take place, but it delayed by 5 years, over cost, and then, of course, when it came in, it had huge amount of other problems to be resolved, and that increases the cost. Over and above that, for the Indian military, now the inventory, particularly if you take the Indian Air Force, look at the number of aircraft that we had on our inventory. And for the operations guy and for the maintenance guy, it's a huge nightmare. At the air headquarters level or at the regional command level, you're trying to manage so many fleets, and to keep them all operationally ready, you got to have multiple supply chains in control. It's costly. It's foolishly costly, and it's a huge challenge. So that recognition has come into the government, recognition has come into the service, but you're trying to meet two objectives, which is linked to the political objective of strategic autonomy and trying to create sources within the country, and therefore you want most of it manufactured here. And therefore you're grappling with somebody who says, I only want business and therefore I'll only sell it off the shelf to you, and you depend on my product support for your this thing, versus Indian requirements of nothing doing. If I'm going to buy 150 aircraft, much of it will get produced here, and the cost has to be addressed in these issues. We have to come to via media. I think much like the US has a system where the US military can buy its equipment only if it is manufactured within the country, and therefore if you want the British aerospace aircraft, when you bought the Harrier and made it as RV-8B, then you transfer the whole production line here, and then you address the value addition part of it. You get full control to yourself. So you have a Rolls-Royce America, you have a British Aerospace America. Much of that process will have to happen in India. And this is what business is all about. So if Rolls-Royce, if Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or Boeing or, much of the American companies want to do business and take advantage of the opportunities that are coming. So the Indian Air Force will be happy to reduce its multiple inventories to as minimal as possible. But if it's produced within the country, it makes that job easier for them to achieve that. That's a very important issue. As far as squadron strength is concerned, this is a question that a lot of bureaucrats ask. If you want a better aircraft, you go for a Rafale or if the F-35 is offered, then why can't you reduce the number of squadrons? We are already precariously low. So we've arrived at. In fact, the Indian Air Force was cleared for a 65 squadron strength post the 1962 war. There was a JRD Tata Committee report that actually recommended, the government accepted that. But because of financial considerations, so the finance ministry said, okay, fine, we accept 65, but let's start with 39.5. That is what we can afford now, and let's build the Air Force to 39.5, then we will take a look of increasing further. That look at increasing further never came. So it got stuck at 39.5. And now, after nearly half a century, the government has now said, fine, now it needs to be minimum 45 squadron. I think that's the bare minimum. And that bare minimum of 45 squadrons is with high-end, best of the aircraft that the Indian Air Force can have, should populate that. Not with MiG-21 class anymore, because MiG-21 was good in 70s, but not anymore. It's out of place in today's context. So the LCA, which replicates the MiG-21, while it has most modern technologies, is a platform, in my opinion, is already obsolete for the requirements of the Indian Air Force. But since it's a national project produced within the country, it has to be supported and next generation has to move on. So DRDO is looking at AMCA, which is the next generation aircraft, which it will need massive assistance from OEMs both in terms of design and in terms of other supports. And here's a huge opportunity for a joint development of an aircraft, which India then can re-strategize to make it available for marketing globally as well. So here's a huge business opportunity. The problem in Indian context is that DRDO will say, don't let Air Force buy aircraft from anywhere else to fill their shortfalls, we are developing. And they're developing like LCA, they will take another 30 years. So what does the Air Force do? the political leaders and the bureaucrats tend to listen to this first, the DRDO's advice, and by the time they realize they've done immense harm to the military machine, then there is a crisis decisions that take place. Much of our acquisitions have been crisis decisions, you know, and in a Cold War time frame, Soviet Union has taken tremendous advantage of it. So, although we didn't want the MiG-23s, it is shoved down our throat because that is what is, available, and you're in a crisis situation, you have to get something like that. So, complications are there, but I think we've come to a point where the private industry has been told, open up now, understand your limitations, go ahead and negotiate what you can get for this, and these are what we require. So I was responsible to release the technologies that the three militaries are looking at. It's a preliminary document, a lot more work needs to be done to revise that further and make it more understandable for them. So we released a technology perspective capability roadmap for industries to look at and start working. Because they've not been there in the defense industry for ever since, their ability to understand what the technology capability roadmap document allows them to do is a problem. Forget about private industry. Even a public sector unit like HAL is grappling in trying to understand. That is because the culture hasn't understood. So I told them, I said, I'm not going to tell you that 15 years later, I need this UAV or this sensor or something to come in. I'm telling you, this is the kind of technology trajectory that's there in play. And if you can do a research, design, and develop products exploiting these technologies, and you make it available to me 10 years from now, then we will take that. So that understanding will come when industries partner with, established OEMs who've been in the game for 50, 100 years, and they learn that process, then they know how to actually work on this process. That's the way to do it.
I will take the last question here.
Thank you. My name is Sid Ravishankar. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and actually my focus is on Indian Ocean maritime security. And it's really unfortunate to see Congressman Forbes go. He's been really important for sea power in the U.S. And I'm really sorry about that. But I have a question for you, Air Marshal. You'd mentioned earlier that in regards to Lockheed, Boeing, and Saab, the Air Chief had mentioned that there's a focus more on Saab now, and you talked about the political needs of procurement as opposed to in relation to industry and public sector. I wanted to ask you about the input that the uniformed services have in addressing India's operational needs and how that conflicts with maybe political needs that the MEA or MOD have, and your experiences in that and the future of that maybe. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, question. Let me clarify one issue very clearly. The political leadership, when they decide to, acquire or get into a contract, it is only done after the military has already said, oh yes, you can go ahead on this area because this meets my operational requirement. Okay, so they are very clear on that. So they don't, mix around in that area. So with respect to these three platforms, they were already in contention for the MMRC. So they were part of the RFP process. They competed in the MMRC process. Since I wrote most of the QRs for the MMRC, let me now give out the intentions, because this you won't find it anywhere in the writing. So we had, originally it was the MRCA, the intention was to bring these inductions by late 90s. And therefore the Indian Air Force actually said, we've already been operating Mirage 2000, told the government, go get more of Mirage 2000 and manufacture in the country and increase our force size. That's what they said. The government dilly-dallied, so the process went on. In 2003, the government finally said 126 aircraft acquisition from a single source without any competitive process is a huge political, disaster for us. We are not going to take that risk. So they said, now go for a global competitive process. I must also, highlight here that the Indian competitive process, which evolved post-Kargil war, and once, because we moved away from the Cold War environment, and then this entire process started off, is seriously afflicted by the Indian bureaucratic, aspiration to project to the rest of the world that our process is transparent, everybody can compete. Okay, and it's a very competitive process, and this is the way it is. I think there is a serious flaw in that process. In any arms acquisition, any development of any weapon system, manufacturing weapon system, the country must just look at its operational requirements, national interest, and to hell with what anybody else perceives me. I need this weapon system, I need to get it. Unfortunately, the CVC, CAG, these govern more in addressing that process than this. I think Modi has recognized that. So he's trying to break out of this bloody logjam. That is one issue. With respect to the MMRCA, so when MRCA was only 4 aircraft in the 90s, and 2003 when the government said we need to go through a global competitive process, so I raised the question. I said there are 4 aircraft in contention, which is F-16, MiG-29, Mirage 2000, and the Gripen. And out of these 4 aircraft, except for the Gripen, which is the latest newly designed, which is applicable for because when you induct an aircraft, it's going to be serving you for the next 50 years. And the other 3 are designs that are already 40 years old. They're also at the last stage of their upgrade. There is no more upgrade potential in their lives. So why are we looking at it? So when I dug into the files, sure enough, one of the bureaucrats had asked that question 5 years earlier as well. So we couldn't remove these 3 aircraft. What we did was we changed the whole process. So a 20-ton limitation aircraft which is defined and designed to actually focus on Mirage 2000, I removed that 20-ton limitation. And we brought in a more professionally expansive approach to it. That's how the Rafale came in, that's how the Eurofighter came in, and that's how the F-18 came in. Okay. Plus, of course, in evolving the RFP, a lot of technology issues were addressed. I must admit to say that all this was driven by Air Headquarters. The role of HAL in addressing technology in the way we understood was not there. They were only looking at production technologies. All right. So, in my opinion, out of the 6 aircraft in contention, which is F-16, Block 60, which was in contention, because now old F-16 were not, in the fray. The Mirage 2000 fell out. In fact, the French said, we are walking out, we won't participate in global competition. And we said, okay, fine, that's your choice. Then they said, no, your requirements of, targeting the Rafale is too expensive for you. I said, that's not for you to say. You're a seller of equipment to me, and we will, buy that. So finally the government forced them to participate. And then you had, the F-16, F-18, you had Eurofighter, and you had the Gripen. Okay, so in my opinion, almost all aircraft would have met the QRs. There were few technology issues like the ISA radar and some of the electronic warfare issues, which were, a bit of a subjective, intangible analysis that could be done. So the Indian Air Force went through that process. They shortlisted 2 aircraft. But in my opinion, the other candidates, other than the MiG-29 version, all the others would have met, by and large, most of the operational requirements. So that drives the decision process now in the government to look at the same contenders all over again. And therefore, you have Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Saab representing to the government. And the government says, we need at least 200 aircraft, and therefore it needs to produce within the country. And that decision will be dependent on cost, obviously. But more important is, what is the production mechanism with the private sector? It's going to come into the private sector. And what is the production mechanism that you're going to establish? What's the kind of technology transfer that's going to take place? Obviously, in the initial stages, production technologies will come anyway. But more important is how this joint venture will then exploit in learning the whole process and then be able to address every aircraft today must be factored for future upgrades. And that upgrade must be completely done by Indians or this joint venture entity. If you're going to do that, then the technology transfer must be understood in the correct context. That is where the government and the chief have said the American presentations doesn't go anything beyond what a Cold War presentation would have been. Okay, which means you're not perceiving and understanding the business opportunity, and you're not perceiving and understanding what India is looking for. So you need to look beyond that. That's it.
Well, good. Air Marshal, once again, thank you. Alex, thank you for your time. I want to thank IWP and Dr. John Lewonsky, along with Mac Owens. Katie, once again, thank you for hosting us, and thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please note down September 20th, we will have Congressman Rob Wittman here, We are carrying on the US-India dialogue to the next level, and Alex would be part of that panel too. I hope you'll be able to join us. Kevin, thank you again. Appreciate it. And A. Marshall will be around. If you have any questions, please direct him directly. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.